The first sound I heard that day was not an alarm, it was laughter. It came through every open channel on my console at once, layered and overlapping, the kind of laughter that only comes from something that has already decided it has won. I sat alone in the command chair of a station most of the galaxy believed was empty, watching 300 warships bloom out of the dark like a rash spreading across my sensor screen, and I let them laugh. I had nowhere else to be, and neither did they, not for the next few minutes anyway. My name is Alex Voss. On old paperwork, back when paperwork still existed, I was listed as a tactical liaison officer. On the station itself, the handful of people who ever spoke to me called me by a different name. They called me Ledger. Not because I kept accounts, although in a way I did, but because the station itself was named Ledger, and after 4 years alone on it, the name had simply become mine too. The station drifted at the edge of a system nobody bothered to name properly. Star chart records called it Approach Point 7. It looked like scrap from a distance, a broken ring of metal that had clearly taken damage decades ago and never been repaired. That was intentional. Ledger was built to look abandoned. It was built to be ignored. For a very long time, that plan had worked perfectly. Then the fleet arrived. They called themselves the Triumvirate, a joining of 3 species who had stopped fighting each other only long enough to start fighting everyone else. I had studied them for years from behind a screen, watched recordings of their victories, listened to translated broadcasts of worlds surrendering before a single shot was fired. They were efficient, they were patient, and today they had decided humanity's turn had come. Their lead ship broadcast on every frequency my station could receive, a message meant for every human ear left in this stretch of space, though as far as their sensors could tell, there was only one ear listening, and it was mine. The voice that spoke was calm, almost gentle, the way a judge might sound when reading a sentence they had already written weeks ago. It said that humanity had been observed for long enough. It said that our unpredictability made us a risk that could not be allowed to continue. It said that the coalition offered one mercy, and one mercy only. Surrender every colony, every ship, every research station, within the hour, or be removed from the record entirely. Wipe them out. That was the phrase their commander used, translated into plain words by my console, stripped of whatever poetry it might have carried in their own language. Wipe them out. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the countdown clock that had already started ticking on my main display, though not the one they had given me. Mine was a different clock. It had been running for 9 years, 143 days, and it was about to hit 0. I switched on my own microphone. My voice went out across every frequency their fleet was using, calm, unhurried, the way you might speak to a neighbor who had knocked on your door at a strange hour. I told them thank you for the warning. I told them it was appreciated, since we had given people the same courtesy for longer than they had probably existed as a joined coalition. Then I told them something that made the laughter on their channels stop, all at once, like a held breath. I told them they were already gone. There was a pause long enough that I could hear my own station humming around me, the low mechanical breath of a place that had learned to sound dead so it could stay alive. Then their commander spoke again, and this time there was no calm in the voice at all, only confusion sharpening quickly into anger. He asked what I meant. He asked if I understood that his fleet alone outnumbered anything humanity could field in this sector by a margin so large it was almost embarrassing to state out loud. He asked if I was making some kind of final, desperate joke before the end. I told him it was not a joke. I told him that humanity did not fight wars the way his people did, ship against ship, weapon against weapon, brute force measured against brute force. I told him we had learned that lesson a long time ago, the hard way, and we had spent 9 years making sure we would never have to learn it that way again. He laughed again, though it sounded thinner this time, less certain than before. He told me that one broken-down station and one lonely human voice was not a threat. He told me his fleet would begin its approach in 10 minutes, and by the time the sun set on whatever world I called home, there would be no records left of humanity anywhere in the coalition's territory. I looked at my countdown clock. 8 minutes remained. Not his countdown, mine. I told him something my old commanding officer used to say, back when I was young enough to still believe war was something that happened between fleets in open space, weapon against weapon, brave against brave. I told him that humans do not build weapons to win a single battle. We build consequences. We plant them quietly, patiently, for years, in places nobody thinks to look, and then we wait, because waiting is the only weapon that never runs out of ammunition. He told me to stop wasting his time with riddles. He told me his patience, unlike his fleet's numbers, was not unlimited. I smiled, even though there was nobody there to see it, because some habits do not care whether they are witnessed. I told him that patience was exactly the point. I told him that everything his coalition had built over the last 9 years, every ship, every station, every relay that let his voice reach mine, across all that empty dark, had been built with pieces that were never fully theirs to begin with. I told him that humanity had spent nearly a decade being quiet, being ignored, being written off as a fading, harmless species clinging to the edges of a galaxy that had already decided it did not need us. I told him that was exactly how we wanted it. The channel went quiet again, and this time I could hear something underneath the silence, something that had not been there before. Uncertainty. Real uncertainty. The kind that starts as a small, cold thought and spreads through a person, or a species, before they even understand why they suddenly feel afraid. I glanced at the clock. 6 minutes. I told him he had a choice. Even though we both already knew there was really only one path left open. He could pull his fleet back now, quietly, and let this moment pass into history as a mistake nobody spoke of again. Or he could continue forward, confident in numbers that had never once been tested against something built specifically, patiently, and lovingly to make numbers meaningless. He did not answer right away. I could hear voices behind him now, other officers, other species, speaking quickly in tones that needed no translation to understand. Something had shifted in whatever room he was standing in. Somewhere out there, systems that had worked perfectly a moment ago were beginning, very quietly, to disagree with their own instructions. He asked me, almost too quiet for the microphone to catch cleanly, what exactly I had done. I told him the truth, because there was no reason left to hide it. I told him I had not done anything today. Today I had simply spoken. Everything else had already been done, years ago, by people whose names he would never know, working in places he would never have thought to look, building things so ordinary and so boring that nobody watching from outside would ever have guessed they mattered. I told him the fleet, bearing down on my little broken station, was not approaching a target. It was approaching the last piece of a puzzle it did not know it had already completed for us. 4 minutes remained on my clock. He told me to explain myself clearly, immediately, or he would order the bombardment to begin without further discussion. I told him that was exactly what I was hoping he would say. I reached forward, past the console showing his ships drawing closer, past the countdown that belonged to him and had never once mattered, and rested my hand over a single control that had waited 9 years for this moment. I did not press it yet. Not quite yet. There is a particular kind of satisfaction in making someone wait for the truth they demanded, especially when that truth is the last thing they will ever fully understand about the species they came to erase. I told him one more thing before the silence swallowed the channel completely. I told him that humanity had never once needed to win the coming battle, because the coming battle had already been decided, quietly, patiently, years before his fleet ever left its home system, before his coalition had even finished deciding my species was worth the trouble of removing. I told him to look, really look, at every system humming quietly around his own ships right now, and ask himself how much of it had ever truly belonged to him. Then I smiled again, wide and easy, the kind of smile that comes only from someone who has already stopped being afraid. And I said the words that would end up meaning more to that fleet than any weapon ever could. "You're already gone." The clock reached 0. 9 years earlier, I was not sitting alone on a broken-looking station waiting to end a war with a single word. I was young, still learning how to read a battle map without my hands shaking, standing on the bridge of a proper human warship called the Halden, watching that same species, back when their coalition was smaller and hungrier, tear through our border defenses like they were made of paper. I remember the sound the Halden made when its hull took damage it was never designed to survive. I remember Commander Daniel Hart standing beside me, calm in the way that only comes from someone who has already accepted that calm is the only gift left to give the people around him. He did not shout orders. He gave them quietly, one after another, buying time for evacuation shuttles that were already full past capacity. We lost that battle. We lost it badly, and everyone on that bridge knew it long before the final systems failed. What I remember most clearly, though, is not the loss itself. It is what Daniel Hart said to me afterward, once we were both aboard a transport heading home, wrapped in blankets that did nothing to stop the particular kind of cold that comes from watching people you know disappear from a sensor screen. He told me that humanity had a choice to make, and it needed to be made quickly, before grief turned into something less useful, like revenge. He said we could spend the next decade trying to build bigger ships and sharper weapons, racing an enemy that already had more of both. Or we could do something almost nobody expected from a species that had just lost a battle so completely. We could go quiet. I did not understand what he meant, not fully, not that night. I understood it slowly, over the following months, as I watched what humanity actually did in response to a defeat that should have broken us. We did not build a bigger fleet. We built smaller ones, and then we hid most of them entirely, tucking them into systems nobody outside our own species had any reason to visit. We did not announce new weapons or new alliances. Instead, we did something far stranger. We opened our doors. Human trade ships began appearing in neutral space, offering technology that looked, on the surface, almost embarrassingly outdated. Simple relay systems, basic reactor components, communication hardware that other species considered charmingly primitive compared to their own advanced designs. We sold it cheaply. We sold it eagerly. We let ourselves be seen as a fading, harmless species, desperate to stay relevant in a galaxy that had already decided we did not matter very much. What nobody else understood, what I did not fully understand myself until years later, sitting across a table from an engineer named Grace Bennett, was that every single piece of that outdated technology had been built with a second purpose hidden quietly inside the first. Grace was the one who explained it to me properly, back when I was still new enough to the program to ask too many questions. She had spent years designing what she called sleeping code, small instructions buried so deeply inside ordinary hardware that no inspection, no matter how thorough, would ever think to look for them. The code did nothing at all, for years at a time. It simply waited, patient in a way that felt almost unsettling to think about, for a single signal that might never come. I asked her once, late at night in a station corridor that smelled like recycled air and old coffee, whether it felt strange to spend her whole career building something designed to stay silent. She told me it felt like planting a very slow garden. You did the work, she said, and then you had to trust that somebody, someday, would need what you had grown, even if you were not there to see the harvest yourself. Over the following years, that garden spread further than most of us on the inside ever fully realized. Every reactor component sold to a curious buyer, every relay station installed by a coalition eager for cheap and reliable parts, every communication array humanity quietly donated to smaller species hoping to gain favor, carried the same sleeping code inside it. Different versions, different triggers, but the same patient purpose. Daniel Hart called it mutual assured relevance, a phrase he used so often it eventually became something like doctrine among the people who understood what we were really building. He explained it to a small group of us once, in a briefing room lit by nothing but emergency lighting, because full power was considered too risky to waste on something as unimportant as comfort. He said that humanity could never win a war fought purely on strength, not against species with numbers and resources so far beyond our own. What we could do, he said, was make ourselves impossible to safely remove. If any coalition ever decided humanity was a problem worth erasing, they would need to understand, clearly and completely, that erasing us would mean erasing pieces of themselves they did not even know were connected to us. I asked him, foolishly, whether that made us any different from the species we were trying to survive against. He looked at me for a long moment before answering, and his answer stayed with me for the rest of my life. He said the difference was simple. We were never trying to win a war. We were trying to make sure the war never needed to happen again. A weapon built to destroy an enemy only matters in the moment it is used. A consequence built to prevent an enemy from ever attacking again matters every single day it goes untouched. I did not fully believe him, not at first. I was young enough to still want something faster, something that felt more like justice for the friends I had lost aboard the Halden. It took years of quiet, patient work, watching sleeping code spread further and further into systems that would never suspect its presence, before I finally understood what he had been trying to teach me. By the time I was assigned to Ledger Station, the program had grown far beyond anything I could have imagined that first night on the transport home. Nearly every major coalition operating near human space carried some piece of our technology inside their own systems, unknowingly, unwillingly, simply because it had been cheap, convenient, and reliable enough to accept without question. Grace Bennett came to see me off the day I left for the station, standing on a landing platform that smelled faintly of engine coolant and rain. She told me something I never forgot, something that made far more sense to me 9 years later than it did in that moment. She said that Ledger Station was not really a weapon at all. It was a promise, kept quiet for as long as possible, ready to be spoken only if it ever truly needed to be. She told me that if I ever had to activate it, it would mean humanity had already lost the ability to avoid conflict entirely, and that the only victory left available to us would be making sure nobody would ever be foolish enough to try it again. I thought about her words often over the following years, alone on a station built to look forgotten, watching quiet reports drift in about coalition fleets growing bolder, growing hungrier, expanding further into space that had once felt safely distant from anything human. I thought about Daniel Hart, who did not live long enough to see whether his plan would ever be needed, having passed away peacefully years before the triumvirate ever became a name anyone worried about. I thought about the Halden and the people who disappeared from that sensor screen so long ago, and I understood, finally and completely, that everything I was doing on that quiet, forgotten station was not about revenge at all. It was about making absolutely certain that no other young officer would ever have to stand on a bridge somewhere, watching friends vanish, wondering if there had been anything at all they could have done differently. By the time the triumvirate fleet arrived at approach point 7, I was no longer that frightened young officer from the Halden. I was something quieter, something more patient, carrying 9 years of careful, silent work inside a single control I had trained myself never to touch without absolute certainty. I thought of Grace's words as I watched their ships fill my sensor screen that day. A promise, kept quiet for as long as possible. I had kept it quiet for 9 years. It was time, finally, to let it speak. The countdown reached 0, and for exactly 3 seconds, nothing happened at all. I want to be honest about that moment, because it was the longest 3 seconds of my entire life. 9 years of quiet work, of trust placed in engineers I would never meet, of patience that sometimes felt more like waiting to wake up from a very long dream, all of it balanced on those 3 seconds of silence. Then the first alert came through, not from my systems, but from theirs. Their own open channel, still broadcasting toward my station out of habit or arrogance or simple confusion, suddenly filled with voices speaking too quickly for my translator to keep up cleanly. I caught pieces of it anyway. Reactor readings, navigation errors. A word that translated roughly as impossible, repeated by at least 3 different voices in 3 different tones of rising alarm. I leaned forward and opened my own channel again, calm, unhurried, the way you might speak to someone who had just realized the ground beneath them was not quite as solid as they believed. I told their commander that I hoped he was watching his own displays closely, because what he was about to see was not an attack in any way he would recognize. There would be no weapons fire from my station. There would be no ships rising out of hiding to meet his fleet in open space. What he was witnessing instead was something far more patient and far harder to undo. He did not answer right away. I could hear him instead, his voice raised, speaking rapidly to people I could not see, demanding explanations that nobody around him seemed able to give quickly enough to satisfy him. I decided, since he had demanded the truth so forcefully only minutes earlier, that it would be a kindness to give it to him properly, piece by piece, while he still had time to understand what was happening before it finished happening. I told him to consider his lead ship first, the one broadcasting his voice to me right now. I told him that somewhere deep inside its communication relay sat a small, unremarkable component, manufactured years ago, sold at a price so reasonable that nobody bothered questioning where it had originally come from. That component had done its job faithfully for years, carrying his voice, his orders, his fleet's coordination exactly as intended. It was still doing its job now. It had simply been given a new instruction to follow, one it had been waiting patiently to receive since the day it was installed. He told me, with real anger cutting through his earlier confidence, that his engineers were already working to isolate the problem, to cut whatever connection I claimed to have. I told him that was a reasonable plan, and that I admired the effort, but that it would not work quite the way he hoped, because the problem was not a single connection at all. It was a pattern, spread quietly across nearly a decade of trade and cooperation, hidden inside pieces of hardware so ordinary that nobody had ever thought to look closely at them. I told him to check his secondary relay stations, the ones his coalition had purchased years ago from human traders, eager to prove we were no longer a threat worth worrying about. I told him those stations were not simply losing power, they were following instructions, quietly refusing to pass along coordinated fleet commands, effectively cutting his ships off from each other, one relay at a time. His voice, when it came back, had lost most of its earlier confidence. He asked, almost too quietly for my microphone to catch, how long this had been sitting inside his systems, unnoticed and unsuspected. I told him 9 years, though the exact number likely meant very little to him in that moment. What mattered was not the number, but the shape of it. 9 years of quiet, patient work, spread across every corner of coalition space that had ever accepted a piece of human technology without asking too many questions. I explained, as gently as the situation allowed, that this was never meant to be an attack in the way he understood attacks. There were no weapons involved at all, nothing designed to cause harm in any direct sense. What his fleet was experiencing instead was closer to a very slow, very careful unraveling, each piece of hidden code doing exactly what it had always been designed to do, simply waiting patiently for a signal that told it the time had finally come. I watched his sensor readings shift on my own display as I spoke, ship after ship in his formation losing coordinated control, drifting slightly out of formation as their navigation systems quietly refused to accept commands from a central authority that no longer had the clean channels needed to issue them properly. He asked, and I could hear something new in his voice now, something closer to genuine fear than anger, whether his ships were going to be destroyed. I told him no, and I meant it completely. I told him that humanity did not build this program to end lives. We built it to end the ability to threaten lives, which was a very different thing, even if the distinction might not feel comforting to him in this particular moment. His crews were safe. His ships would remain intact. What they would lose, entirely and completely, was the ability to act as a coordinated fleet capable of carrying out the order he had given only minutes earlier. He asked, quieter now, almost as if speaking to himself rather than to me, how humanity had managed something so vast without ever being noticed. I told him the truth, because there was no reason left to withhold it. I told him that humanity had learned, painfully and completely, that being underestimated was not a weakness at all. It was the single greatest advantage a species could ever hope to have. While his coalition and others like it spent years building bigger ships, sharper weapons, more impressive fleets meant to be seen and feared, humanity had spent that same time being quiet, being patient, letting ourselves be dismissed as fading and harmless, all while planting something far more difficult to remove than any weapon could ever be. I told him that fear, built from strength, eventually meets something stronger and fails. Fear built from patience, spread quietly across nearly every system an enemy depends on, does not fail nearly as easily, because there is no single point left to strike against. You cannot destroy a pattern the way you destroy a fleet. He was silent for a long moment after that, long enough that I began to wonder if the channel itself had finally failed along with the rest of his fleet's coordination. When he spoke again, his voice sounded different, smaller somehow, though I understood that word did not quite capture what I was hearing. It was the voice of someone who had walked into a room expecting to find an enemy and instead found a mirror, showing him a truth about his own coalition's vulnerability that he had never once considered before this moment. He asked me directly, without any of the earlier confidence or anger, what would happen next. I told him that depended entirely on what his coalition chose to do once coordination returned, which it eventually would, slowly and carefully, once my station finished delivering its final instructions. I told him that humanity had no interest in continuing this beyond what was necessary. We were not trying to conquer his coalition, or claim territory, or prove some larger point about strength. We were simply trying to make absolutely certain that no fleet, from his coalition or any other, would ever again think it was safe or simple to demand our surrender. I told him that once his ships regained full control, he would find that his coalition's technology remained exactly as capable as it had been before, in every way except one. It would no longer be capable of coordinating an attack against human space, not through any system that had ever touched human hardware, which by this point included nearly everything his coalition depended on to function as a unified fleet. He asked, and there was something almost desperate in the question now, whether this could be undone, whether there was some way to restore what had been lost. I told him honestly that I did not know, and that the answer likely depended less on me and more on choices his coalition would need to make going forward. I told him that humanity had never wanted this outcome. We had hoped, quietly and for 9 long years, that the sleeping code buried across coalition space would never need to wake up at all. Every single day it remained dormant had been a small, unnoticed victory, proof that peace, even a fragile and untrusted peace, was still possible. Today, his coalition had made a choice that ended that particular quiet victory. I told him that was not something I took any pleasure in, despite what my earlier smile might have suggested. There is a difference between confidence and joy, and what I felt in that moment was closer to relief than anything else. Relief that 9 years of careful, patient work had done exactly what it was designed to do, without a single life being lost in the process. He did not respond to that for a long time. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried something that sounded almost like respect, buried underneath everything else he must have been feeling in that moment. He asked what would happen to his fleet now, drifting and disconnected at the edge of a system that had turned out to be far more dangerous than anyone in his coalition had ever suspected. I told him the truth, because it seemed, finally, like the only thing left worth offering him. I told him his fleet would remain exactly where it was for a while longer, slowly regaining limited control over individual ships, though never again the kind of coordinated authority needed to threaten anything beyond itself. I told him his crews were safe, and would remain safe, and that eventually, once enough time had passed, his coalition would need to decide what kind of relationship it wanted with a species it had just learned it could never safely attempt to erase. I told him that decision was not mine to make. It belonged to him, and to whoever above him would need to hear this same explanation, probably several times, before they truly believed it. Then I told him one final thing, quietly, without any trace of the earlier grin that had started this entire exchange. I told him that humanity had spent 9 years hoping this moment would never come. Now that it had, I hoped, sincerely, that neither of us would ever need to have this particular conversation again. The channel remained open a while longer after that, filled mostly with silence, occasionally broken by quiet, uncertain voices from his crew, reporting small, careful progress as they slowly regained partial control of individual systems. I stayed in my chair and listened, not out of any need to gloat, but because it felt important, somehow, to witness the moment fully rather than simply walk away from it. Outside my station, drifting quietly at the edge of a system that had never had a proper name, 300 warships sat scattered and disconnected, their crews safe, their coordination gone, their mission ended, not with destruction, but with a truth none of them had been prepared to hear. They had come looking for a species easy enough to erase from the record. Instead, they found 9 years of patience waiting quietly for exactly this moment, and a single human voice, calm enough to explain, without anger and without cruelty, exactly why that plan had never once stood a chance. I did not celebrate. I want that understood clearly, because it would be easy, listening to this story secondhand, to imagine some triumphant scene aboard my little station, a single human, standing victorious over a scattered fleet, laughing the way their commander had laughed at me only minutes earlier. That is not what happened, and it is not who I was in that moment. What I felt instead, sitting alone in that quiet command chair, was something closer to exhaustion, the kind that settles into a person only after a burden they have carried for years is finally set down. 9 years of watching, waiting, wondering whether the sleeping code Grace Bennett and so many others had built so carefully would ever actually be needed, or whether it would simply sit forgotten inside coalition hardware forever, a promise that never had to be kept. Today, it had been needed. That was not a small thing to sit with. I thought about Daniel Hart first, the way I often did in quiet moments aboard the station. He had not lived to see this day, had passed peacefully years earlier, never knowing for certain whether the plan he helped build would work the way he hoped, or whether it would simply be forgotten, replaced eventually by newer strategies dreamed up by officers who had not lived through the loss of the Halden the way he had. I found myself wishing, uselessly, that he could have seen this moment, could have heard the silence on that alien channel where confident laughter had been only minutes before. I thought about Grace Bennett too, still working somewhere back in human space, likely receiving the same quiet confirmation I had just triggered, a simple signal traveling back through relays and communication arrays to let the wider program know that Ledger Station had done exactly what it was built to do. I wondered what she would feel in that moment, whether it would be pride, or relief, or the same tired exhaustion settling over me now, 9 years of careful, patient gardening finally reaching its harvest. The triumvirate fleet remained scattered outside my station for several more hours, slowly regaining fragments of control, ship by ship, system by system. I watched their sensor signatures shift on my display, drifting further apart before eventually beginning to gather back into something resembling formation, though nothing like the confident, coordinated force that had arrived only that morning. Their commander reached out to me twice more during that time. The first time, his voice was still shaken, asking careful, quiet questions about how far the sleeping code had actually spread, whether other coalition territories beyond this fleet were affected in the same way. I answered honestly, because there seemed to be no reason left to hide anything. I told him the program had spread wherever coalition trade routes had carried human technology, which by this point included a significant portion of infrastructure across territory his coalition considered fully under its own control. I could hear the weight of that answer land on him, even across an open channel filled with static and distance. It is one thing to lose a battle. It is another thing entirely to realize that the ground you have been standing on for years was never as solid as you believed. The second time he reached out, his voice carried something different, something quieter and more careful than either the confidence from earlier or the fear that had followed it. He asked, almost hesitantly, why humanity had chosen this particular method. He said his coalition understood weapons, understood fleets, understood strength measured against strength. What we had built instead felt, to him, almost more troubling than any weapon could have been, because it meant humanity had been inside his systems for years, patient and unseen, without ever once being detected. I told him the truth, the same truth Daniel Hart had once given me on that quiet transport ride home so many years earlier. I told him that humanity had learned a hard lesson the first time we faced his coalition in open combat, watching ships and people disappear from sensor screens in a battle we never had any real chance of winning through strength alone. I told him we had decided, collectively and carefully, that we would rather build something that made such a battle unnecessary in the first place than spend endless years chasing an arms race we could never realistically win. I told him this was never meant to be cruelty. It was meant to be prevention, built quietly and patiently, in the hope that it would never actually need to be used. He was quiet for a long moment after that. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried something I had not expected to hear from him, something that sounded almost like understanding, even if it was clearly still tangled together with frustration and loss. He told me that his coalition would need time to fully understand what had happened here today and what it would mean for their relationship with human space going forward. He told me, honestly, that he did not know yet whether that understanding would lead toward peace or toward something else entirely, once the shock of today had settled and cooler decisions could finally be made. I told him that was fair, and that humanity was not asking for immediate trust, only for a clear and honest understanding of the choice his coalition now faced. I told him we had no interest in using what we had built to control or dominate his people. We had built it only to survive, and to make absolutely certain that surviving would never again require the kind of loss my old commanding officer had carried with him for the rest of his life. Before the channel finally closed between us, he asked one last question, quieter than everything that came before it. He asked whether I regretted what I had done today, whether some part of me wished there had been another way. I thought about that question carefully before answering, because it deserved an honest response rather than a quick or easy one. I told him that I did not regret preventing what his fleet had come here intending to do. I told him I did regret that it had ever come to this point at all, that 9 years of quiet hope for peace had ultimately not been enough to prevent a demand for our surrender. I told him I hoped, sincerely and without any trace of the earlier confidence in my voice, that this would be the last time either of our peoples needed to have a conversation like this one. He did not answer right away, and eventually the channel closed on its own, drifting into the same static silence that had surrounded my station for years before today, and would likely surround it again now that its purpose had finally been fulfilled. I sat alone in my command chair for a long while after that, watching the scattered fleet outside slowly regain enough coordination to begin a careful, uncertain retreat back toward their own territory. I did not feel triumphant watching them go. I felt, more than anything else, a quiet kind of tiredness that comes only from finally setting down something heavy you have carried for far too long. I thought about the people I had lost aboard the Halden so many years earlier, names and faces that had stayed with me through every quiet year on this station. I thought about how none of what had happened today could bring any of them back, and how, in some strange and complicated way, that fact did not diminish what had been accomplished here. It simply made it feel less like a victory and more like a promise finally kept. Grace Bennett had told me once, standing on that landing platform so many years ago, that Ledger Station was not really a weapon at all. It was a promise, kept quiet for as long as possible, spoken only if it truly needed to be. Today, it had needed to be spoken, and I had spoken it as gently and as honestly as I knew how, without ever once raising a weapon against a single living soul. As the last fragments of the triumvirate fleet finally disappeared from my sensor range, retreating slowly and carefully back into the dark they had come from, I found myself thinking not about the war that had almost happened, but about the quiet years that stretched out ahead, uncertain but no longer immediately threatened. I did not know yet what would come next, whether the coalition would eventually return with peace or with renewed anger. I only knew that for today, at least, the promise had held, and humanity remained exactly where it had always chosen to be: quiet, patient, and impossible to safely remove. 3 months passed before the triumvirate coalition sent another message toward human space, and this time it did not arrive as a fleet. It arrived as a single, unarmed courier ship, moving slowly and carefully through the same system where Ledger Station still drifted, broken-looking and quiet, exactly as it had for years before that single strange day changed everything. I was still stationed there when the courier arrived, though by then I was no longer entirely alone. A small support team had joined me eventually, once command decided that Ledger's true purpose was no longer a secret worth protecting through isolation alone. Among them was a communications officer named Nathan Cole, sharp and quick-witted, who had a habit of narrating events under his breath as though preparing them for some future report. Beside him worked Olivia Marsh, an engineer who reminded me constantly of Grace Bennett, careful and patient in exactly the way that kind of work required. When the courier ship requested permission to approach, I granted it without hesitation, though I noticed Nathan glancing toward me with the particular kind of wariness that comes from someone who has heard the full story secondhand rather than lived through it firsthand. I understood the feeling completely. Trust, once broken as severely as it had been that day, does not return quickly or easily on either side of a conversation like ours. The message carried aboard that courier ship came from someone I had not spoken with directly before, a representative from the coalition's civilian leadership rather than its military command. Her name, translated as closely as our systems could manage, was something that came out sounding like Elira Voss Kane, though she quickly told me, almost gently, that a simpler version would be fine for our conversations going forward. She asked that I simply call her Elira. Our first real conversation took place over an open channel, carefully monitored on both sides, each of us aware that whatever was said in that exchange would likely shape the next chapter of whatever relationship existed between our two peoples. She began, to her credit, not with demands or accusations, but with a question that surprised me at the time, though it made a great deal of sense once I considered it fully. She asked why humanity had chosen restraint. She said her coalition's analysts had studied the events of that day extensively in the months since, and had concluded, almost unanimously, that humanity could have done far more damage than it ultimately chose to do. She said the sleeping code embedded across their infrastructure could have been used to cause far greater harm than simple disconnection and confusion. She wanted to understand, honestly and directly, why we had chosen the gentler path when a harsher one had clearly been available to us. I told her the truth, the same truth I had given her fleet commander during those tense hours months earlier. I told her that humanity had never built this program to cause harm. We had built it to prevent harm, specifically the kind of harm that comes from being seen as weak enough to safely attack. I told her that using it for anything beyond that original purpose would have made us no different from the very threat we had spent 9 years quietly preparing against. She was quiet for a long moment after that, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something thoughtful, almost curious, rather than defensive. She asked whether humanity would be willing to discuss a different kind of relationship going forward, one built on clearer, more honest terms than the quiet, hidden infiltration that had defined the years leading up to that single tense day. She said her coalition, chastened significantly by what had happened, was prepared to consider terms that neither side could have imagined discussing seriously only a year earlier. I told her that decision was not entirely mine to make alone, though I promised to carry her proposal back to the people in human space, who were far better positioned than I was to negotiate something as significant as a lasting peace. I told her, honestly, that I hoped such a conversation would be possible, because 9 years of quiet patience had never been meant to lead toward endless tension. It had only ever been meant to buy enough time and safety for a real peace to eventually become possible. Over the following months, that single conversation grew into something larger, careful negotiations carried out not through fleets or ultimatums, but through representatives from both sides meeting slowly and cautiously, testing trust in small measured steps rather than large uncertain leaps. I was not present for most of those later negotiations, having eventually returned to human space myself, my long assignment aboard Ledger finally coming to its natural end. Before I left the station, though, Nathan Cole asked me a question one evening that stayed with me long afterward, sitting together in the quiet common area that had slowly become less empty over the preceding months. He asked whether I thought humanity would ever need to use something like the sleeping code program again, whether peace with the triumvirate coalition would truly hold, or whether we were simply delaying an inevitable conflict that would eventually return in some different form. I thought about that question carefully before answering, the way I had learned to think about most things during my years alone on that quiet station. I told him that I did not know for certain, and that anyone who claimed to know something like that with complete confidence was likely not being entirely honest with themselves. I told him that peace, real peace, was never a single moment reached and then permanently secured. It was something built continuously, carefully, through choices made again and again over years, much like the quiet garden Grace Bennett had once described to me on that landing platform so long ago. I told him that humanity's greatest strength had never really been the sleeping code itself, powerful and clever as it was. Our greatest strength had always been patience, the willingness to plant something quietly and wait years to see whether it would ever be needed at all. I told him I hoped, sincerely, that whatever came next for humanity would require far less of that particular kind of patience, and far more of the simpler, gentler kind that comes from two peoples slowly learning to trust each other after a very difficult beginning. By the time I finally left Ledger Station for the last time, watching it grow smaller through a transport window, much like the one I had once watched the Halden's wreckage disappear through so many years earlier, the coalition and human space had reached the early framework of something resembling a genuine peace agreement. It was not perfect, it was not free of tension or lingering suspicion on either side, but it was real, built carefully rather than demanded suddenly, and that felt, to me, like exactly the kind of outcome 9 years of quiet work had always been hoping to reach. I think about that day often, even now, years removed from the tense hours spent alone in that command chair, watching a confident fleet scatter into confusion, and eventually into careful, humbled retreat. I think about Daniel Hart, who never lived to see whether his plan would succeed, and about Grace Bennett, who spent years building something she hoped would never need to be used at all. I think about the crew members aboard that triumvirate fleet, frightened and confused, who nonetheless walked away from that day with their lives intact, carrying home a lesson that reshaped how an entire coalition understood the quiet, patient species living at the edge of their territory. Mostly, though, I think about the simple truth that carried me through that single tense day, the truth I offered without anger or cruelty to a commander who had arrived expecting an easy victory and left instead having learned something far more valuable than any conquered territory could have given him. Humanity was never trying to win a war that day. We were trying to make absolutely certain a war never needed to happen at all, and we had spent 9 long, quiet years making sure that if it ever did, the outcome would already be decided long before the first shot could ever be fired. He demanded that we be wiped out completely, confident and certain in a strength he believed could never be seriously challenged. I did not raise a weapon against him. I did not need to. I simply told him the truth, calmly and clearly, and let 9 years of patient, careful work speak far louder than any single voice ever could. "You're already gone," I told him. And by the time he understood what those words truly meant, it had already been true for longer than he ever could have imagined.